When I was studying English literature at school in England in the 60s, the most lyric writers by far seemed to be Celtic. And then there's the accent, how it lilts its way through the body and into the heart. More than half a century later, this is still my experience. I'm Ingrid Rose. This is Writers Radio. Ethel Whitty is one of those writers who follows in her ancestors' musical wake. She was born and raised in Cape Breton and emigrated from there to the West Coast in her early 20s. She wrote The Light a Body Radiates in stolen moments and occasional weeks of solitude while working for 12 years as the director of the Carnegie Community Centre in Vancouver's downtown eastside. A graduate of the Simon Fraser University's Writers' Studio, she currently lives in Vancouver. This is Ethel Whitty, and we had the fortune, it wasn't long enough, but for a brief period, I was in the same writing group as Ethel. So I actually got to hear not just the novel that you published, but I got to hear little bits of a novel that you were embarking on.
Yes. I think you probably heard the piece that I'm going to read for Writers Radio.
So the title of your first novel is just magnificent.
The Light a Body Radiates was the novel published in 2018.
In this excerpt from her first novel, The Light a Body Radiates, we meet 8-year-old Eileen McPherson trying to make sense of conflict and violence, both in her working-class Cape Breton family and in the wider world.
Mama sewed a dress for me, the color of the ocean. It was made of silk jupiani with the warp and weft of different hues, so that it shimmered aqua blue with a quivering of sand when the fabric floated and twirled around my legs. It recalled the sea on a day when it rushes and spills against the shore and disturbs the earth beneath it. The memory of the dress lives more in my solar plexus than in the recesses of my brain, and the amount of meaning I give it is a mystery when I think about the magnitude of everything else going on in the world right then. Millions of workers were on strike in France, and students had burned down the stock exchange in Paris. The Vietnam War and all of its atrocities could be watched in our living room almost every night. I found it so difficult to understand why people were doing the things they were. Iona had more opinions than I did, but Mama said that if I didn't know how to reply when some older person asked me what I thought, it was perfectly acceptable to say, I don't know anything about that. She said, imagine how mortified you'd be if you were caught pretending to know something you do not. Those poor buggers, my father said, watching airplanes drop bombs and soldiers and civilians running for cover or shot dead in their tracks. Who are the ones causing it, I asked. Oh, they'll tell you it's the communists or the radicals, but you'll never really know unless you're there. On the day of the dance, I put the final stitches on the dress and modeled it for Mama in her hospital room. You look outstanding, said Iona. Mama didn't say anything, but her eyes were bright, and I knew what she was thinking. Iona planned to stay and keep her company for a while, so I changed back into my jeans and carefully folded up the dress in tissue paper and put it in a dress box. I walked home carrying it in front of me as if it was a large cake that had to remain flat. On the way, one of the neighbors fell into step with me, saying, "What do you have there?" "It's a dress that Mama sewed for me." "Dear God, you mean to tell me you still have her at the sewing machine, even in her hospital bed? Small wonder the poor woman is sick." She abruptly turned off at the next corner and left without letting me explain. It was not the first time it occurred to me that we might be the reason Mama sometimes collapsed with exhaustion. I would have happily foregone the dance that night, but I knew I had to go. The dress was her gift of beauty to me. When I got home, my father was waiting for me at the door. "How is she?" "She's pretty good," I lied. "I started supper," Neil said, "and I could smell something burning." When we went into the kitchen, a thin line of smoke was leaking from the oven, so he opened its door, grabbed the pan with the charred roast, and roughly flung it onto the back porch to cool down. "I was planning to make hash anyway," I said, and pulled some leftovers out of the fridge. With Stella married and gone away, there was just me, Iona, Joe, and Murdoch left at home. While he ate, Neil sat in his place at the head of the table, with his hands curled in fists around a knife and a fork, held upright as if he'd forgotten how to eat. "I found it really warm today," he murmured. Murdoch picked up on that theme and said, "Yes, it was really hot when we won the ball game today." "You won, did you? 7-4. Well, good then. You beat the other guys. I'll have to tell your mother that." There didn't seem to be anything else to say until we wolfed down the last of the supper, and Neil spoke again. "You boys are doing the dishes tonight. Eileen has to get ready." They protested that they'd never done them before and didn't even know how, but I believe they broke a plate and a cup more out of resistance than clumsiness. That morning, Iona and I had cleaned the house and got everything put away that normally looked messy, like all the shoes and boots cluttering the front hall. We threw out the stacks of newspapers that had gathered on all the chairs and pulled the overflowing ashtrays out from under the Chesterfield where my father had tucked them as a way of tidying up. Then we washed and pressed the blueprint curtains that hung around the kitchen sink. We even found a nice wool blanket to put on the threadbare Chesterfield and washed and waxed the linoleum carpet that covered the planks of the living room floor. That evening, when I finished dressing and came downstairs, I was proud and satisfied with how clean and homey it looked. Even the plywood lying against the stair rail looked fine, as if there was a new job to be done and we were in the middle of it. The boys were watching boxing on television with my father. I stopped to look and could see that two men, one of whom was called Tiger, I think, were smashing each other on the head. My father was sitting at the edge of his seat, his feet shuffling in front of his chair, and one fist kept jabbing out involuntarily. When the man called Tiger got a good punch in, they all cheered and laughed. It took them a while to even notice me, and when he did, my father said, "What did Mama think of the dress?" "She thought it was beautiful," I said. "Well, she's always right about that," he agreed. Then the man named Tiger knocked the other one out and they all went crazy. I closed my eyes and pretended that the wild cheering of my brothers was intended for me. The feeling of standing inside the dress, surrounded by their noisy and joyous applause, is one I draw on still, when I want to remember what beauty feels like from the inside out.
Ethel Whitty reading an excerpt from her first novel, The Light a Body Radiates. I'm curious, how come a novel, like for your first book and now obviously for your second, how did that come about?
Well, that is interesting because I certainly could have gone the route of creative nonfiction. And in fact, I would say what I write is closely aligned with creative nonfiction. I mean, I in the first novel, I drew heavily from my life experience, but it was not a memoir, and I took great liberties with changing that story. And so, would you call that creative nonfiction? Not really. It's really more of a novel. And in this current one, it's less. There are elements. I think there probably always are elements of your life that you draw from when you're writing. either in broad strokes or in minute strokes. And that would be true for this one too, but it's much more of a fiction, in more pure fiction, I would say, in that way. That's informed by my life experience. So it's a bit different.
So the question that comes to me is, do the characters, like, how does it work for you? Now, of course, like many of us, we know in theory quite a lot about novels, because for many of us, certainly in England, I was brought up more to be a literary critic than to be a creative writer. And I always thought that that was a stumbling block to become a creative writer. But I've always heard that for fiction writers, the characters will speak to them. They'll want to be heard. What is your experience?
It's been slightly different with both novels. In the first novel, though, the characters, if they were not drawn from my life, were people I recognized, and got to know as I was writing them. That novel was totally a character-driven novel. I followed those people around for sure, to see what they were up to. There was a real element of that to that writing, which makes the process then of crafting the story different than if you start with a story. You have these people's lives and you're there with them while they live them and are writing down their experience and their thoughts. It's still, you're waiting for the story to emerge in a way. Would I say they spoke to me? I listened,
Getting the right voice for each character, like actually inscribing, or not inscribing, I suppose, but capturing accent or intonation or the way somebody speaks.
Right. I think it really is about embodying the character. If you've embodied the character, which takes some time for me, it's not something that's necessarily there right off. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you know exactly who that person is right off the top, but sometimes not. And I know with this novel, it's taken me time with some of the characters, and I still have a way to go with some of the characters to fully embody them. One of the things that I'm thinking about these days, which I have thought about before, but hadn't been thinking about as much with this novel, is that for me, the characters are much more likely to be fully realized if I love them. I can be writing a character that is kind of the character who's the stumbling block in the whole thing, and maybe not even a very nice person in terms of the effect they're having on the people around them. But that if I can't find a way, if I can't find the good person in there too, and find a way to care about that character, then they're never going to be fully realized.
This next piece Ethel Whitty is going to read is from her upcoming novel. Whose song is this?
This is Kat McPherson on her way home after being assaulted at a party. On the walk home, there are monsters watching her. It could be a swirl in a tree trunk or the way objects appear through the fog, but they are monsters until she can get close enough to see that they are not. A particularly distorted head sits in a dress shop window. Its eyes are closed and running with some kind of goopy liquid. She makes herself walk up to the window until she's close enough to see that it's a slouchy suede purse. She's used to this. In fact, she sometimes finds it funny once it stops being terrifying. There is no fun at all in it tonight. At home in her bedsit above a store on Barrington Street, with the pulse of street traffic flashing on her white walls, she pulls the dress off over her head and hangs it on the window frame. It swings as if it might jump to the street below. The cerulean blue cover of the new Arbrzina album beckons to her from where it sits on the green arborite kitchen table. Her favorite colors. The knife she uses to cut the cellophane so it remains intact to protect the cover is perfectly sharp and nicks her hand. After she carefully lines up the needle with the album and lets it softly drop, a bead of bright red oozes from the back of her hand. It's a beautiful color, and she lets it go for a moment, careful to catch the drip. The haunting high notes of runes, dedicated to the unknown, fill the room. It feels as if her brain can predict the pitch and duration of every sound, and she's not so much listening as co-creating. This often happens when she first hears a piece of music. She knows it's just her brain recognizing that sequence of notes for the first time and simultaneously storing them, but it's thrilling anyway. The music whirls like a dancer, and the dancer is her. She holds the knob of the door to the bathroom as if it's a partner and sways and moves to the eerie melody. Her breath returns to normal. She washes in cold water and band-aids the hand before crawling under her covers with those melancholy sounds floating over and around her. Why, when she's devastated, does it help to hear a devastatingly sad piece of music? Maybe because somehow the sadness becomes music rather than pain. She stores every note in her mind's music cache where it can easily be retrieved. The motion of it rocks her to sleep.
Ethel Whitty reading from her upcoming novel, Whose Song Is This? Give us a little bit an idea of what is your writing process.
I came to writing really through acting. I was an actor in my 20s and or actually my late 20s, 30s, really, when I was, working full time as an actor. And that's where my interest in writing really started. And I became fascinated with dialogue and really with the human conversation, and how that all works. And I wrote some plays and a couple of film scripts and whatever at that time, and only came to narrative story writing later. It was kind of an evolution for me, for sure, from that. Sometimes my process is very much a conversation that starts happening in my head with a character and another character, or character and herself or himself. Sometimes it's more like, I don't know, more like a daydream, I guess. You know what I mean? Just there in a situation and letting it develop, letting my mind just go to develop that, to be there in that situation. When you're following the characters around like that, you can end up, especially my first novel was multi-generational. So I had too many stories going in the beginning and had to try to winnow down a story. Trying to shape the story then from all these written pieces. I did do this. You take all the scenes you have and you put stickies all over the wall, naming all those scenes. And then try and figure out what the patterns are. What's really there on the wall? What are you talking about in the big picture, not the close picture? That was a lot of the process the first time. So the second time I decided that I wanted to tell a story that I would fill in, that the characters would arrive in, and then I would figure out how they were in that story. And that if the story changed because the characters wanted it to change, then it would, you know what I mean? But that I would see what it was like to have a framework of the story first. And so I sort of wrote a 2-page story and then started. And that's got its advantages and disadvantages. It can lead you down a path that isn't fruitful sometimes because you're trying to fulfill the story rather than just search for something, just let something more interesting happen, maybe, you know. That was where I got into the position where character, you know, in the 2-page story that was barrier character to the protagonist, but I had to find out a whole lot more about that barrier character, you know. I guess for me, it's going to have to come down to character, you know, and who those people are.
You've been listening to my conversation with novelist Ethel Whitty, who read an excerpt from The Light a Body Radiates, published by Caitlin Press in 2018, and also an excerpt from her upcoming novel, Whose Song Is This? You can find The Light a Body Radiates at your favorite bookstore. I'm Ingrid Rose, host for this program, Radiant Storyteller, Ethel Whitty. This is Writers Radio. Enormous appreciation to my dedicated and brilliant co-hosts and producers, Carol Harmon and Gary Sill, our very own composer, improviser, and radio whiz. I highly recommend tuning in to Gary Sill Music, where you can subscribe to his Substack blog, Music is the Mystery That Imagines Us. Also, go to Carol Harmon's Substack blog, Leaning Toward the Light. Then come back to writersradio.ca to listen to our podcasts at your leisure.
You have been listening to Writers Radio, a non-commercial collaborative project which presents talented writers reading their own work. These stories, essays, and conversations revisit the long tradition of oral storytelling that connects us to the inspiration behind the words. Be sure to check the website, writersradio.ca, to subscribe to our free notifications list. It's also a way of letting the writers know you are there and appreciating their creative work.
Writers Radio broadcasts from Half Moon Bay on the Sunshine Coast in Canada, traditional tribal land of the Sechelt Nation of the Coast Salish peoples. We express our gratitude for their wisdom teachings and land stewardship.